scenario. On the first night of Operation Desert Storm in 1991, a U.S. Navy pilot is shot down over Iraq.
As of 0900 this morning, Washington time, there's been a single American aircraft lost.
With no sign of life, the pilot is declared dead.
The first thing I said was, I don't think Spike's coming back.
10 years later, the unthinkable.
The indications are that somebody did get out of the airplane.
We're going to do our best to find out if he is alive, and if he is, to get him out.
Now, new information suggests the pilot may be alive after surviving more than 12 years as a prisoner of war in Iraq. It's the first night of the 1991 Gulf War. Diplomatic efforts have failed to evict Saddam Hussein from Kuwait. Coalition pilots ready themselves for battle as Operation Desert Storm gets underway.
Just 2 hours ago, Allied air forces began an attack on military targets in Iraq and Kuwait. Tonight, the battle has been joined.
On board the aircraft carrier USS Saratoga, American F-18 pilots run through their final checklists. Among them, a young Navy lieutenant commander named Michael Scott Speicher. Back home, they call him Scott. Aboard the Saratoga, they call him Spike. Speicher is a member of VFA 81, an F-18 squadron also known as the Sunliners. Tony Albano, a fellow Sunliner, is Speicher's roommate.
We had dinner, then we tried to get a little sleep, and I think we just essentially listened to each other breathing. And after probably about 30, 45 minutes just laying there, I said, that's it, I'm out of here, I can't go to sleep. He goes, me either.
On this night, the Sunliners have good reason to be anxious. 5 of them have been chosen to penetrate deep into enemy territory, to destroy Iraqi radar and surface-to-air missile sites just west of Baghdad. Speicher is one of them.
Our first priority was to get control of the air, but the main effort was directed at the Iraqi Air Command and Control System and taking their fighters and their radar-guided SAMs out of the war early.
33 years old, Scott Speicher has been flying fighter jets since he joined the Navy fresh out of college. With over a decade of flight experience, he has racked up more carrier landings than anyone in his squadron. Just the sort of Top Gun the U.S. Navy is glad to have on its side.
I'm Scott Speicher of VFA 81 out here on the Saratoga, and I'd just like...
Back home, Speicher's family nervously sits by and waits for the letters he writes every week.
He would always say, you know, we're prepared to go, do whatever we need to do. We've been practicing, we know how to do it, and I never sensed any fear from him at all.
I'd also like to say hello to my wife, Joanne, my son, Michael, and Megan. I love you and I miss you.
Speicher's a family man, married to his college sweetheart and father to a 3-year-old daughter and 1-year-old son. Squadron mates like Barry Hull respect him for his even demeanor and cool head under fire.
Flying with Spike in practice, there was good and bad. If he was on your side, it was great. If the schedule came out and you were going to fight Spike, for me personally, I tended to go to bed a little bit earlier because I knew that unless I flew the perfect fight, I was probably going to get beat.
At 1:15 a.m. local time, Speicher and his fellow Sunliners roar off the deck of the Saratoga for their 5-hour mission. Joining them in the nighttime sky is an international armada of hundreds of coalition aircraft from nearly a dozen countries. At coalition headquarters in Saudi Arabia, Lieutenant General Charles Hornet is in charge of the air campaign.
Desert Storm, day in and day out, probably represented the largest air effort that has ever been assembled in the history of aviation. Imagine a country about the size of Texas, the entire sky filled with airplanes so you could see them as far as the eye could see. It was a very complex and huge operation.
Horner has alerted Allied Commander General Norman Schwarzkopf to expect losses, as many as 4 dozen.
I can tell you the opening moments of the war were filled with dread because of the fact we knew we were going to lose our people.
Once in the air, all 5 Sunliners join up on their designated refueling tanker and are led north towards the Iraqi border.
There'll be 4 or 5 of us all flying formation, all cycling in, taking our turns on the basket. And when it's your time to go, you just fall out of formation and go. There's not a word spoken.
As the commander of a sister squadron, Bob Stumpf leads a group of another 5 strike fighters. His element joins up with Speicher and the other 4 Sunliner pilots to form a 10-ship strike package.
At about 50 miles south of the border, the tanker said, that's it for us, you guys see you later. And once we get that squared away, we've got the time you hit the border, and now we're thinking about enemy threats. We're thinking about what's the air picture, what other threats do we have to deal with.
As the 10 F-18s cross the border into Iraq at 700 miles an hour, it doesn't take long before the sights and sounds of war are everywhere.
Way out on the horizon was this, it looked like an inverted orange pulsating bowl. And I just had no idea what it was. And as we got closer and closer, as it turned out, it was the city of Baghdad.
I thought it was the Aurora Borealis, just like the Northern Lights in Alaska. And then I realized it's them shooting at us. And then I was really nervous.
A little over 2 hours into the mission, fellow squadron mate Phil Gardner hears over his radio that things are beginning to heat up. All of the earlier activity is stirring up the nest.
There's a lot going on. It sounded like the F-15s had made their sweep and already gone through, and they were actually talking about 2 MiG-25s basically capping over our target.
The Iraqi Air Defense Network knows the coalition planes are coming. Iraq is fighting back and has dispatched Russian-made MiG fighters to intercept. Barry Hull's cockpit fills with the unmistakable sounds of imminent danger.
We have a piece of early warning gear in the cockpit that puts out signals to us. And I got a diddle-diddle, and then now it distracts me. Then I get diddle-diddle, diddle-diddle. Finally, it's diddle-diddle-diddle-diddle-diddle. It's just like that, and it's overloading me. I had talked to an old Vietnam guy that said they used to turn theirs off, and I just reached over and turned it off.
Tony Albano is about 10 miles away from his commanding officer when he receives word of a hot contact. His skipper has engaged an enemy MiG fighter.
I was frantically looking for this guy on my radar. The skipper was actually chasing him around in a circle trying to get confirmation from the AWACS.
He's asking the controller to declare this a bandit. Controller won't do it. So he chooses not to shoot, and it blows across the corners of the formation, and it's gone. At least in my mind, it's gone. So we just keep on pressing toward the target.
Soon after, Bob Stumpf, flying a few planes down from Speicher, turns his attention to a huge flash in the sky.
At some point off to my right, I detect a real large explosion, not on the ground, but rather roughly at my same altitude, which was high 20s, 28,000 feet or so. So my immediate thought was, that's a SAM going off somewhere. That's a warhead going off.
The fighters continue toward their target and launch their weapons. As they turn back to head for home, each pilot radios in, one by one.
The commanding officer was checking in to make sure all of his birds were good. And you can hear everybody checking in. We can't raise Spike. So I get on the back radio, which was a squadron frequency, and I'm calling to Spike. And it's just, Spike, this is Skull. Spike, how copy? Spike, come in. Spike, you with me?
I mean, I'm looking at my fuel state, and I'm looking, well, you know, he doesn't have much more flight time than I do, if any. Actually, probably has less, because if something happened to his airplane, he's probably using more gas. So either one, he's already landed in Saudi Arabia, or he's ejected out of the airplane. And of course, the ultimate worst fear is that that was him in the airborne explosion.
The possibilities race through everyone's minds. The Saratoga pilots head back towards their ship in disbelief, and without Scott Speicher. A few hours later, back in Washington, then Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney and then Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff Colin Powell brief reporters.
As of 0900 this morning, Washington time, there's been a single American aircraft lost. It involves a single casualty. I don't know that we want to identify the aircraft, do we?
It was an F-18.
Was that a wound or a death?
A death.
Despite the predictions of gloom, Scott Speicher is the only pilot shot down that first night in 1991. But his squadron mates aren't ready to throw in the towel.
It took us by surprise, and we kind of went, what? Where is he getting that?
No one was going to convince me, because I flew that night, no one was going to convince me that he was dead. He was too good for that.
It was only natural for Speicher's friends to want to believe he was alive. But as the days turned to months and the months to years, the official story of Scott Speicher's disappearance would come undone, and the reports of his death would soon be deemed premature. The night Scott Speicher went down over the Iraqi desert, very few details were available to those responsible for organizing a search and rescue. It was, after all, the first night of the '91 Gulf War, the largest military operation of its kind, and the fog of war was heavy and thick.
Not one person in our boat said he was dead. The only person that said he was dead was at a news conference back in the States, and I, along with everybody else, I guess assumed that they had more information than we had. That there was something that they knew that we didn't know.
Admiral Stan Arthur, in charge of all Allied naval forces in the Gulf War, is aboard the USS Blue Ridge in the Persian Gulf when he hears that one of his pilots has been lost.
It was my impression that everybody got back from the first strike. And it wasn't until just a little bit later that we started getting reports from the Red Sea guys that there was an airplane missing.
Around dawn, the 4 remaining Sunliners returned to the Saratoga. They have survived the first night of conflict, but Scott Speicher is nowhere to be found.
I was on the strike the next morning against Western Iraq, and as I was leaving my room, Captain came on the loudspeaker and told the ship that the aircraft from the first strike package were returning, that Lieutenant Commander Scott Speicher's aircraft was not among them, and that they were searching among the outlying airfields in Saudi Arabia to see that if perhaps he had diverted.
Those coming off the mission gather to try to figure out what has happened to their friend.
The bottom of my ladder, and I think it was the first question we asked. Where's Spike? What do you know?
I think the first thing I said was to our gunner, our chief warrant officer on deck. I said, "Hey Bob, I don't think Spike's coming back." We went down and debriefed our mission to our intelligence officers, and making sure that the SAR search and rescue effort at least was being initiated.
Word soon arrives that Speicher hasn't diverted to any of the backup airfields.
It was a very somber, serious meeting, because now we know something bad has happened. You don't want to address your own mortality. You don't want to think that somebody could be shot down, especially Spike. You're kind of numb at that point.
Without any indication that Speicher has ejected, search and rescue personnel are put on alert to listen for any sign of his survival.
The general rule is that, one, you need to know that with some good reliability that the individual was able to egress from the aircraft. 2, you have to have a fairly good fix on the location. And 3, you've got to be able to communicate. In a hostile environment, we just don't go in and circle around an area hoping that we're going to find something.
Making matters worse, even if Speicher has ejected, some fear his emergency radio, his best means of two-way communication, could have fallen out during the ejection sequence.
The new radios were certainly a little longer, a little bit taller, a little bit bigger. They would sit inside a pouch that was Velcroed around the top and had a zipper down the side. A little antenna would stick out and things like that. So this pouch was very much custom fitted for the old radios, and initially the pockets weren't modified.
Speicher can also be located by his ELT, or emergency locator transmitter, built into his ejection seat. But once again, there is a problem.
The emergency locator beacon normally is automatically activated when the ejection seat fires. And that's an emergency distress beacon that goes out and can be received by anybody who can receive that frequency. So obviously the enemy can receive it also, and that's why we disconnected them going in.
The pilots know that without communication from Speicher, the chances for his recovery are slim. But they think they can provide his location, dead or alive.
I know that one of the pilots in my element had actually seen the explosion. It was in his field of view, and he was able to put a time to that, relative time, and therefore he was able to sort of figure out where he was over the ground based on when that happened.
By approximating their positions in relation to the sightings of the fireball, Speicher's squadron mates extrapolate his coordinates. According to their calculations, he has gone down deep in the Iraqi desert, a no man's land, barren and uninhabited. Perhaps he is still alive. Needing to get ready for their next mission, they turn the information over to the experts. Tony Albano heads back to his stateroom.
I did cry, thinking, oh my God, I hope my roommate is all right. And not only my roommate, my good friend, and just praying that he comes back to us safely.
You can reflect on missing a pilot and what that means and how that affects you and how that affects him, and do what you need to do. But in fact, the professional sequence at that point is you've got to get ready to go again and assume that the command structure is going to take those other actions.
But U.S. military commanders are limited by the realities of the situation.
Without any indications that he had survived, no indications that he had ejected, we basically assumed that we had a downed airplane and a downed airman that had not survived the incident.
During Operation Desert Storm, 37 coalition aircraft went down. Only 7 rescue missions were launched. 3 pilots were recovered, each of whom had survived their ejection. But had Speicher ejected? If so, was he a survivor as well? For the next few weeks, the war continues. The rescue network is activated, but without any sign of survival, no search and rescue mission is ever launched.
I never accepted that he was dead until somewhere during the war, maybe toward the end of the war, at a calm time, you began to let yourself come to terms with the fact that he was dead.
42 days after Scott Speicher first launched off the Saratoga, the war is over. Kuwait is again a sovereign nation.
And as president, I can report to the nation, aggression is defeated, the war is over.
Some experts had predicted as many as 10,000 American soldiers would be killed in the war to liberate Kuwait. Much to the credit of Allied commanders, casualties were well below expectations. But 146 American soldiers lost their lives. Among them, the name Lieutenant Commander Scott Speicher.
A few days after the war began, I received a telegram from Joanne Speicher the wife of the first pilot killed in the Gulf, Lieutenant Commander Scott Speicher. Even in her grief, she wanted me to know that someday, when her children were old enough, she would tell them that their father went away to war because it was the right thing to do.
After that mission, I came back and I started talking to the other guys. Just, hey, when did you leave the tanker? How many guys? And it turned out that Spike was the last one on the tanker. And I was the next to last, looking down. That's the last time I really saw Spike alive. I mean, I wasn't talking to him. I was just looking down into his cockpit. I remember thinking what a powerful sight that was. And that was the last time I really ever put my eyes on him. And then I left. And then shortly after that, he left as well.
In 1993, 2 years after Speicher was shot down, the wreckage of his F-18 would finally be located. But instead of finding answers, the Navy is faced with more questions and a growing mystery surrounding the fate of Scott Speicher. At the end of the '91 Gulf War, prisoners from both sides are reunited with their loved ones. Although Scott Speicher has been informally pronounced dead by the Secretary of Defense, he is not officially listed as killed in action, nor is he a POW. Officially, he is still missing. So Speicher's family and friends hold out hope for a miracle.
After the ground war was over, I was sent to Riyadh as they were repatriating the POWs. And when neither a live Spike or remains that may have been Spikes came off that airplane, I was sent back to Saratoga. And then when we left that area on the Saratoga, headed back home, I had a sick feeling in my stomach that I was never going to see him again.
Lieutenant Commander Scott Speicher is officially declared dead on May 22, 1991. 4 months after being shot down. He's hailed as a national hero, the first casualty on the first night of the 1991 Persian Gulf War.
Right before the ship went out, he came by the house. You know, I hugged him goodbye, and I said, remember, and he started laughing. He said, I know. The Navy can build more planes, but I only have one rear. And I said, that's right. And that was the last words that we said to each other.
To his family, the declaration seems final. Scott Speicher's name is forever enshrined in the annals of military history. Then one day in 1993, Tony Albano, now stationed at the Pentagon, comes across a classified email message.
Probably I shouldn't have received or been on my message board. It wasn't to me specifically, and I read this subject and went, wow, okay, they found his wreckage.
2 years after Speicher had been shot down, a group of Qatari hunters on an expedition in the Iraqi desert stumbles upon the wreckage of what they believe is an American fighter plane. They take photos and present them to American investigators.
Here's two of them holding the nose cone. Here's two of them standing next to the wing, the vertical stabilizer. They brought back a piece of the aircraft that had a data plate on it, and turned that into to the consulate, U.S. consulate in Qatar, who forwarded it back to the United States.
Closer examination confirms it's an American F-18. Markings engraved into the metal indicate it's from Lieutenant Commander Speicher's plane. A U.S. spy satellite is dispatched to have a closer look. Officials are surprised that much of the aircraft seems to be intact, despite the eyewitness reports at the time of the explosion.
There, in fact, was the airplane with the canopy some distance apart. That was enough for me to know that there had been an ejection sequence started on that airplane, and that we now did not know everything that we should know about that incident.
One thing is clear. For the first time since the night of his disappearance, the Navy has evidence that Speicher's plane hadn't disintegrated in a fireball as earlier reported. The military knows that the answers to their questions will be among the wreckage. But this means sending a team in on the ground, deep inside Iraq and outside the protection of the 2 no-fly zones. Pentagon officials are hesitant to risk lives with a covert mission, so the U.S. government decides to go the diplomatic route and asks Baghdad for permission to visit the crash site. A critical decision that will take almost 2 years to coordinate. In the winter of 1995, a team is assembled and led by the International Committee of the Red Cross. It includes investigators from the Army's Central Identification Laboratory in Hawaii and an expert from the Navy's Crash Investigation Unit in China Lake, California.
The original plan was to stay out there as long as it took to find out what information we could find to determine the fate of the pilot. And we were going to excavate that area and do what we had to do to recover any bones or any flight equipment, whatever the case may be.
9 months have passed since Iraq agreed to the excavation. But Baghdad has postponed the trip 3 times. Pentagon officials fear the Iraqis are stalling for time. In an attempt to maintain the integrity of the site, the exact location of the wreckage is kept secret from the Iraqis until the last minute. But someone has let the cat out of the bag.
As they were going down the road, there were Bedouins who were like giving them traffic directions. You want to turn here, you want to turn here, to take them directly to the site. It was clear that the knowledge of where the site was widespread.
Speicher's cockpit, so clearly identified in the earlier satellite photos, has disappeared.
The sand had been sifted and the site had been professionally excavated. So the Iraqis got there before us. Someone got there before us. Let's put it that way.
But the team does find the canopy. It's located about a half mile from the primary wreckage site, suggesting an ejection. But since the site has been altered, they can't be sure.
The canopy was placed vertically in the dirt and buried as a landmark, what appeared to be a landmark in that area because it's such a flat surface out there. So it had to have been moved. It didn't land like that, it didn't hit like that.
And that isn't the only curiosity.
At one point, Bedouins or some of the Iraqi minders, in very animated, come over here, brought the team over and pointed on the desert floor to a flight suit.
Investigators are immediately suspicious.
Why would a flight suit be near the crash site in the desert without anybody in it? No remains, no apparent remains. It's unlikely that anyone would get out of their clothes having survived a shootdown.
Over the next few days, the team conducted a thorough excavation of the wreckage. What they would continue to find would only add to the mounting list of questions. And what they would eventually determine would confirm everyone's worst fears. Nearly 5 years after Scott Speicher's plane had been shot down over Iraq, investigators finally reached the crash site. Based on the satellite photos they saw before leaving the U.S., most think the plane will be inverted. They prepare themselves for the possibility that Speicher's remains will be underneath the wreckage.
It was very much intact, actually, for an aircraft, usually that it's flat. So it's pretty well confined. It's not scattered out for a large area. And it was not inverted like we originally thought. It was actually right side up.
Investigators find spent flares and part of a survival kit, but no sign of Scott Speicher. Only the tattered remains of a flight suit, suspiciously devoid of bloodstains or bone fragments.
It was laying on the dirt when I got there, and it was encircled by the Iraqi general and some of their investigators. The Iraqis said, that is Michael's flight suit, and I knew that they were referring to Spike. And I looked at it. The label was partially missing, but it was an American flight suit.
Investigators cannot immediately determine if the flight suit belongs to Speicher. Testing will have to be conducted once back in the U.S. On their 4th day in the desert, they strike gold. The data storage unit of Speicher's jet.
Whomever had come and excavated the site and taken out the cockpit figured they'd take all evidence of how the plane got there, as well as any evidence of the pilot's success or not. Well, they didn't get this. So that was the second piece of physical evidence.
2 days later, the team pulls out. 5 days of an extensive excavation has yielded a mound of raw evidence. It would take time to sift through everything. But during those 5 days, Trenholm got a sense of what Speicher would have gone through if he had successfully ejected.
Looked like you were on a moon's surface, but only with gravity. You know, not a good place to go. And I'm thinking, you know, if this gentleman did in fact eject, you know, hundreds of miles as far as you could see, you can run, but you can't hide.
A few weeks later, Tony Albano, Speicher's old roommate aboard the Saratoga, gets a call. Bruce Trenholm wants to meet with him.
He wanted to bring what he thought was Scott Speicher's flight suit for me to try to provide another avenue of identification of it.
The thing was that the flight suit still had pile tape sewn on the flight suit. And what I wanted to do was get their patches, get some photographs of Speicher to see if I could do a comparison analysis.
And he laid this thing out very tenderly, and I mean, just by looking at the Velcro patches that were on the shoulders, there was no doubt in my mind that was his flight suit.
2 months after they arrive back in the U.S., investigators have recovered enough information from the damaged data storage unit so that they can reconstruct the final minutes of Speicher's last flight. Up until 2 hours into the mission, the data indicates normal flight operations. But then, nearing the target, Speicher's radar warning receiver, which could detect threats from land or air, begins to malfunction. 17 seconds later, it's all over.
If you looked at all the stuff that we found out in the desert, the small pieces, and you wanted to assume that that was the flight suit, and then you assume that all this equipment came from the aircraft, then you can safely assume that an ejection occurred, that he actually got out of the aircraft.
Word of Speicher's ejection spreads quickly and takes everyone by surprise.
I get this call. Hey, you know, they found the crash site. I go, really? Good ejection. What? And now I'm just getting chill bumps going, oh, don't tell me we left this guy there. You know, don't.
Officials studying Trenholm's report are bothered by something else. Up to that point, 58 aircrew have ejected from F-18s. And although a majority were injured in the process, 90% of those who ejected survived. When Speicher was declared dead back in 1991, those who loved him most had to pick up the pieces and move on with their lives. Speicher's widow, Joanne, ultimately remarried to Buddy Harris, also a Navy pilot and an old friend of Speicher's. While stationed at the Pentagon after the war, it was Harris who was one of the first to connect the dots and raise questions about Speicher's fate.
We found out that a lot of the information that we had initially was misinformation, that a lot of the boxes that we thought were checked were not checked at all. Scott was kind of just left out on the wind.
With news of the ejection, speculation about Speicher's fate ran rampant. Rumors of supposed sightings were flying out of Iraq.
The Iraqi folks are very intelligent people, and they're trying to get money. They're trying to extract something from us, and they come over and they go, hey, I talked to Scott, and this is what he said. And if you believe it, it can rip your heart out.
Then in 1999, a startling event. An Iraqi intelligence officer defects and seeks asylum in Jordan. American investigators are dispatched to debrief him. The defector recalls that shortly after the war started, he received an order to pick up a foreign pilot who had been shot down in the desert and was being held by Bedouins.
His job was to take his truck, go down, pick up this foreign pilot, and bring him to Baghdad. Actually, he brought him to a hospital about 20 miles outside of Baghdad.
U.S. intelligence agents administer a polygraph and ask him to pick Speicher out of a lineup. In the end, they deem the defector's story is credible.
It was through his testimony that we're very convinced that Scott at least arrived in Baghdad with no life-threatening injuries.
With new information in hand, Buddy Harris met with then Secretary of the Navy Richard Danzig in the winter of 2001.
It was determined that the only way to change the way the control of this case was to change its status. The White House came back with the argument that publicity could kill him. Are we willing to do that? I countered that argument in that they've held him for all this time. Why would they kill him just because now we think that he might be alive?
Harris had convinced Secretary Danzig to change Speicher's status to MIA, missing in action. The first time an American in any war had ever been removed from the killed in action list and declared MIA instead. Soon after, President Bill Clinton met with reporters.
We're going to do our best to find out if he is alive, and if he is, to get him out. Because as a uniformed service person, he should have been released by now if he is alive.
Scott Speicher, once a confirmed combat casualty, was now officially resurrected. And the Navy was back to where it began the night Speicher was shot down. They had a pilot who was missing. The only question remaining was whether they would write Speicher's epitaph or prepare his homecoming parade.
You are watching Missing, Prisoner of Iraq. After the show, log on to Discovery.com and click on Discovery Spotlight to find out more about Lieutenant Commander Michael Speicher's story, only at Discovery.com.
When Scott Speicher's status was changed from KIA to MIA, a curious thing happened. Speicher was promoted to the rank of captain, even though no one had seen him alive in nearly 10 years. As the chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, Senator Pat Roberts of Kansas is one of the leading voices in Congress on the Speicher case.
When I signed up in the Marine Corps, the sergeant told me, son, you get in trouble, we'll send the whole platoon after you. If the platoon can't do it, we'll send the company. If the company can't do it, we'll send the regiment, division, then the whole damn Marine Corps. Your life is worth that to us in defense of your country. And Scott Speicher is the anomaly of somebody that we left behind, and that is not right.
In December 1997, Roberts read a New York Times story that angered him. The article said that the satellite sent over the wreckage years earlier had detected a man-made symbol in the sand, possibly the type a pilot would be trained to make if he was trying to communicate his position to rescuers. More recently, the Washington Times reported that the CIA had been provided with British intelligence accounts claiming that Speicher was being held in an Iraqi prison under the direct control of Uday Hussein, the notorious elder son of Saddam. U.S. officials neither confirm nor deny the report. But in October of last year, the Secretary of the Navy took a highly unusual step and changed Speicher's status yet again. This time from missing in action to missing captured.
I concluded that at some point, Speicher was indeed a prisoner of the Iraqis, that he had been seized by the Iraqis. Doesn't say that he is a prisoner today, but it says at some point he was seized by the Iraqis.
Exactly what information the Navy has, it's keeping close to its chest.
We're still at this. We're still interested in getting answers, and to some extent, being too forthcoming about what we know will hurt our chances of getting additional information in the future. So unfortunately, because of the intelligence methods involved, much of the details can't be revealed.
I mean, the question is, in all these years, why hasn't Saddam, why haven't the Iraqis come forth and provide us information? He did go down in their territory. They certainly know what happened to him.
In 2000, an Iraqi Air Force general granted an interview to American television.
We handed over all the prisoners, all the pilots after the war. Why would we keep one pilot, whether he is dead or alive?
U.S. officials don't have that answer, but they do have some history. In September of 1980, an Iranian pilot was shot down over southern Iraq at the beginning of the Iran-Iraq War. 17 years later, Saddam Hussein unexplainably let him go.
He gasses his own people, he abuses his own people. So trying to come out with a rational answer to someone who's totally irrational, I mean, who can explain most of the acts of Saddam Hussein?
In 1991, the UN Security Council demanded that Iraq return all prisoners from Kuwait and other lands. More than 600 people remain unaccounted for. One American pilot is among them.
Even the local community in Speicher's hometown has mobilized in a multimedia attempt to learn the truth about their friend.
You have to really sit down and take the puzzle as it's played out to really understand what went on. But the bottom line is we need to go do what needs to be done to bring this guy home and try to understand why it occurred and not let it happen again.
They're saying that he may be over there. Well, go get him. Just go get him and bring him home.
If coalition forces did find Speicher alive, he would be 45 years old and be returning to a very different world than the one he left behind 12 years ago.
Finding out what happened to Scott is paramount. And it's a huge piece missing from my wife, too. There's no closure. It was never solved in her mind, and so there's just that piece that's missing, and it'll always be missing until we get it resolved.
In March 2002, the U.S. government received an invitation from Saddam's regime inviting them to Baghdad to discuss Speicher's case. But the man in charge of coordinating the U.S. government's efforts to find Scott Speicher didn't think anything new would have been learned.
Before committing a team to go to Baghdad to investigate the case, we wanted to plumb the depth of honesty and sincerity in the invitation. And so we sent back a list of questions that we had. And we have yet to receive a response from the Iraqi government on that.
To this day, many questions are left unanswered.
I mean, it'd be very nice to have the facts of this matter, but we don't have the facts. Only the Iraqis have the facts. It would seem to me it's very straightforward for them to come forward and tell us what they know about this case.
There's a famous saying in war that the first reports are usually wrong. But that doesn't prevent them from being the first reports.
I don't think there's anything that could have been done differently that first night. We had reports of people taking direct hits by SAM missiles in Vietnam. Their wingman says there is no way that he survived that hit. And later on we found out they had. So, and that's exactly what we had here.
In the case of Scott Speicher, confusion rather than conspiracy seems to have ruled that fateful night over a decade ago.
We are loath to leave our people on the battlefield in any condition. Had there been anything to go on, I'm confident Admiral Arthur, the other operational commanders there, would have, and the brave folks who populate the combat SAR community would have gone in a heartbeat to get this flyer.
The USS Saratoga was decommissioned in 1994. Up until a few years ago, it was believed to be one of the last places that Scott Speicher was ever seen alive. Now, a family and a nation watches and waits. After a second war with Iraq, coalition forces in Baghdad search for answers. But so far, even the fall of Saddam Hussein has yet to solve the mystery and bring Scott Speicher home.
Discovery Communications, The New York Times. Two great names team up to present the new Discovery Times channel. Programming that brings you the why behind what's happening, like this true story of the search for American pilot Michael Speicher. Missing, Prisoner of Iraq. Join us for an encore presentation Tuesday, May 6, beginning at 8 on the Discovery Times channel. The new network available 24 hours a day. Call your digital cable or satellite provider today and ask for the Discovery Times channel.